If someone told you that humanity's greatest collapse doesn't begin with wars, famine, or destruction, but with a silent error in the collective mind, would you believe them? Hermes Trismegistus believed them. And more than that, he warned that this error would not be perceived as a threat, but as progress. That's how the line begins to be crossed. Hermes didn't speak from mystical visions disconnected from the world. He observed patterns. He observed cycles. He observed how entire civilizations repeated the same mistakes, always convinced that this time would be different. For him, humanity is not heading towards collapse out of absolute ignorance, but out of a more dangerous kind of blindness, the kind that arises when human beings believe they have already understood everything that matters. Hermes's forbidden prophecy does not announce the end of the world. It announces the moment when humanity ceases to recognize the laws that underpin reality itself. And this moment is not marked by an external event, but by an almost imperceptible internal change, a shift in the mind, a silent departure from the truth. Hermes taught that everything that exists is born first in the mind, not as opinion, but as a universal principle. The mind is not merely an instrument of thought, it is the field where reality begins to take shape. When a civilization loses this understanding, it begins to act as if the world were something separate from itself, something to be dominated, exploited, or corrected by force. And it is at this point that error takes hold. The unsettling fact is that this process doesn't happen abruptly. It happens gradually while everything seems to be working. Technological advances, expansion of knowledge, increased control over the environment. All of this creates the illusion of evolution. But Hermes warned, evolution without consciousness is not ascension, it is acceleration towards imbalance. In his teachings, he described an invisible threshold, a point where human beings still believe they are in control, but have already lost the ability to understand the consequences of their own choices. It is not a physical line, it is a mental line, and once crossed, it alters how reality is perceived. Hermes observed that when the collective mind deviates from universal laws, the external world begins to reflect this rupture, not immediately, but cumulatively. Small distortions accumulate, values are inverted. What was once considered wisdom comes to be seen as backwardness. What was once a limit becomes an obstacle to be eliminated. Here an uncomfortable question arises. What if humanity is not moving forward, but only moving further and further away from self-understanding? Hermes did not see the forgetting of universal laws as a simple intellectual error. For him, it was a perceptual collapse. Human beings still see the world, but no longer understand what they see. They still act, but do not understand why they act. This is the essence of the omen. Not chaos, but the normalization of chaos. Not ignorance, but excessive confidence in fragmented knowledge. Hermes asserted that the most dangerous moment for a civilization is not when it suffers, but when it believes it no longer needs to question its own foundations. He spoke of a humanity that is beginning to confuse quantity of information with wisdom. That is coming to believe that understanding isolated parts of reality is the same as understanding the whole. But universal laws do not function in fragments. They operate in an integrated, continuous, and relentless way. Hermes observed that when the collective mind distances itself from understanding the correspondence between the planes, humankind begins to treat effects as if they were causes. It tries to correct the external world without ever questioning the internal state that produces it, and the more it tries to control the effects, the further it gets from the origin of the problem. This is the point where the omen ceases to be abstract and becomes intimate, because Hermes wasn't just talking about civilizations, he was talking about individuals. He asserted that the collective downfall begins with millions of small internal disconnections, small concessions to illusion, small abandonments of mental responsibility. The question he left hanging in the air was uncomfortable. What happens when an entire species loses the notion that its thoughts shape its experience? What happens when the mind ceases to be recognized as a cause and begins to be treated only as a consequence? Hermes taught that at this stage, humanity continues to advance technically, but regresses in understanding. And the more it advances without awareness, the harder it becomes to realize that something essential has been lost along the way. There is no alarm, no clear warning, just a diffuse feeling of emptiness, confusion, and displacement. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the omen is this. According to Hermes, the line is not crossed by an external collapse, but by an internal choice, repeated countless times. The choice to ignore universal laws when they become inconvenient. the choice to substitute understanding for control, the choice to believe that reality can be manipulated without consequences. Observing previous cycles, Hermes perceived a consistent pattern. Every civilization that crosses this threshold believes it is at its peak. It believes it has surpassed the limits of the past. It believes it is an exception to the laws that governed all others. And it is precisely this belief that marks the beginning of the rupture. The forbidden prophecy begins here. Not with destruction, but with forgetfulness. Not with sudden darkness, but with a gradual distancing from that which keeps reality in balance. Hermes was not warning of divine punishment. He was warning of an inevitable effect. And before revealing how this line manifests itself in concrete terms, he left one last provocation. If the mind is the principle of everything, what happens when an entire humanity ceases to understand how the mind itself operates? It is from this question that the true meaning of the line begins to reveal itself. Hermes Trismegistus stated that the line is not something one sees, but something one lives. It doesn't appear on maps, it doesn't surface in the news, and it doesn't announce itself as a threat. It manifests itself in the way the human mind comes to interpret the world. That's why almost no one notices when they begin to approach it. According to Hermes, it all begins with a subtle shift in the relationship between mind and reality. Human beings cease to see the mind as a creative principle and begin to treat it merely as a tool for reaction. Instead of understanding that thoughts shape decisions, emotions, and actions, they come to believe that they only react to what happens outside themselves. This is the first shift. Small, almost invisible, but decisive. To make this understandable, Hermes often used simple examples. Imagine a person who wakes up every day believing that the world is hostile, competitive, and unfair. Without realizing it, this belief guides their choices, their tone of voice, their attitudes. They begin to attract conflict, confirm their own expectations, and reinforce the idea that they are surrounded by threats. In their eyes, the world is the problem. For Hermes, the problem begins earlier, in the mind that interprets. Now imagine millions of people living this same pattern at the same time, not through conspiracy, but through mental habit. Hermes claimed that when this state becomes collective, external reality begins to reflect exactly this imbalance. Institutions become aggressive, relationships become disposable, systems begin to operate by force, not by understanding. The line, therefore, is not crossed when something goes wrong, but when that pattern ceases to be questioned. When the collective mind accepts as normal living in a constant state of tension, comparison, and fear. Hermes taught that the human mind adapts quickly to what it repeats. The danger lies not in the initial error, but in the unconscious repetition. In everyday life, this manifests itself in subtle ways. People who feel a constant emptiness but can't explain why. Who consume information non-stop but feel they understand less and less. Who have access to more resources than any previous generation, but live with a feeling of lack. Hermes would say that this is not a coincidence, it's a consequence. For him, the mind cannot withstand prolonged contradictions without fragmenting. When external discourse promises freedom, but the internal experience is one of imprisonment, something begins to break. A person tries to compensate with distractions, consumption, or excessive control, and the more they try to escape internal discomfort, the further they get from the real cause of the problem. Hermes taught that the line draws closer when humanity begins to confuse movement with progress. Being busy is not the same as evolving. Producing more does not mean understanding more. He observed that declining civilizations are often extremely active. They build, expand, innovate, but without conscious direction. A simple example helps to understand this. Think of someone who runs around all day, completes tasks, answers messages, solves problems, but never stops to reflect on the meaning of what they do. At the end of the day, they feel exhausted, unfulfilled. Hermes claimed that a civilization can enter exactly that same state. Much movement, little awareness. It is at this point that the law of the mind ceases to be recognized. Human beings begin to believe that simply adjusting external factors is enough to solve any problem. More technology, more rules, more control. But Hermes warned, when the mind remains in the same state, the effects always return, even if they change form. He observed that, by ignoring the mind as the cause, humanity begins to treat symptoms as if they were origins. It combats visible effects without ever questioning the invisible patterns that produce them. And the more you do this, the more complex and difficult the problems become. Here emerges a disturbing element of Hermetic teaching. Hermes asserted that universal laws continue to operate, regardless of whether they are understood or not. Ignoring them does not weaken them, It only makes their effects more severe. The line is crossed when humanity insists on acting as if it were above these laws. In everyday life, this manifests when someone believes they can sustain an internal state of conflict without consequences, that they can live for years in denial, resentment, or mental disorder without it affecting their relationships, decisions, and health. Hermes taught that the mind always exacts its price, sometimes slowly, sometimes abruptly. When this pattern expands, the collective enters a similar state. Decisions are made without a long-term vision. Consequences are pushed into the future. Immediate logic replaces wisdom. Hermes called this a loss of alignment with universal laws. The line then ceases to be merely an abstract concept and becomes a lived experience. People feel that something is out of place, but they can't name it. They seek external answers, but they don't question the internal assumptions. For Hermes, this is the most delicate point in the cycle. He said that the human mind prefers comfortable explanations to transformative truths. Therefore, when the line is drawn, narratives emerge that alleviate individual responsibility. The blame is always external. The problem is always outside. This transfer of responsibility is a clear sign that the understanding of mental law has been lost. Hermes did not see this as a moral failing, but as forgetfulness. A profound forgetfulness of the mind's role as the origin of experience. And the more this forgetfulness spreads, the harder reality becomes to sustain. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect is this. According to Hermes, most people cross the line believing that nothing has changed. They continue living, working, planning for the future. But something essential has already been altered. The ability to perceive the relationship between internal cause and external effect begins to disappear. This is where the suspense intensifies, because according to Hermes, after this point, reality begins to respond more rigidly, not as punishment, but for balance. Universal laws seek to restore the harmony that has been ignored. And before explaining how this response manifests itself, Hermes offered a silent warning. When the collective mind ceases to recognize its own influence on reality, it enters a stage where the effects begin to seem unpredictable and out of control. It is at this moment that the line ceases to be just an idea and begins to transform into something irreversible. Hermes Trismegistus stated that when the line begins to be crossed, the signs do not appear as obvious tragedies, but as subtle changes in the way reality is perceived. For him, collapse never announces itself as collapse. It disguises itself as normality, as routine, as something that has always been this way. That is why most people don't realize when they are already in the midst of the process. According to Hermes, one of the first signs is a gradual loss of meaning. People continue to function, but they no longer know exactly why. They work, consume, move around, but feel a disconnection that is difficult to explain. It's not deep sadness or explicit despair. It's a constant feeling of displacement, as if something essential is missing even when everything seems to be in its place. And here arises an uncomfortable question. If there has never been so much access to information, why do so many people feel increasingly confused? Hermes said that the human mind was not made to accumulate data without integration. When an excess of stimuli does not transform into understanding, it becomes noise. This noise fragments perception. The individual comes to know many isolated things, but loses the ability to see connections. And without connections, there is no wisdom. Another clear sign of the approaching line is the inversion of values. Hermes observed that when a civilization begins to confuse speed with intelligence and visibility with truth, something profound is breaking down. What requires silence is avoided. What requires reflection is considered a waste of time. The collective mind enters a state of permanent agitation. In everyday life, this is reflected in a growing difficulty in remaining silent. Silence becomes unsettling. It exposes unresolved thoughts, unprocessed emotions, and ignored internal conflicts. To avoid this confrontation, the mind seeks constant distractions. Hermes warned that a humanity that flees from silence is, in fact, fleeing from itself. But what happens when an entire society avoids looking inward? Hermes taught that when introspection disappears, the external world begins to become increasingly noisy. Conflicts intensify. Opinions become radicalized. Everything needs to be immediate, definitive, extreme. Nuance disappears. Complexity becomes unsettling. The collective mind begins to seek simple answers to profound problems. Another important sign is the artificial sense of urgency. Everything seems to demand an immediate response. Decisions are made under constant pressure. Hermes said that this urgency does not stem from reality, but from a disorganized mental state. When the mind loses its center, it begins to live reacting to the environment, never leading. At the individual level, this manifests as chronic anxiety. At the collective level, as continuous instability. Nothing lasts for long. Trends emerge and disappear quickly. Ideas are adopted without reflection and discarded without learning. Hermes observed that this pattern indicates a break with the law of correspondence. And here's an important break from the norm. Hermes didn't see these signs as errors to be combated, but as messages to be interpreted. According to him, every external manifestation carries an internal meaning. Crises don't arise to destroy, but to reveal. When humanity ignores these revelations, the signs intensify, not because of the universe's cruelty, but because of the coherence of its laws. Another disturbing sign of crossing the line is the loss of mental responsibility. People begin to believe that their internal states have no direct relation to the results they experience. Emotions are seen as inevitable reactions, not as processes that can be understood and transformed. Hermes taught that this is a serious mistake. He argued that when human beings see themselves only as victims of circumstances, they relinquish their own creative power. The mind ceases to be the cause and begins to see itself only as the effect. This shift is one of the most critical points in the process. But what happens to a civilization that forgets that its thoughts shape its collective experience? Hermes said that, at this stage, increasingly complex systems emerge to try to compensate for the lack of awareness. More rules, more surveillance, more external control. All of this arises as an attempt to correct what has not been resolved internally. The problem is that no external system can replace the understanding of universal laws. Another clear sign is the growing difficulty in dealing with consequences. Hermes observed that societies near the crossing of the line tend to push problems into the future. Decisions are made thinking only about the short term. Tomorrow becomes a convenient abstraction. In everyday life, this manifests when someone ignores small imbalances until they become too large to be easily corrected. A neglected bad habit, an ignored strained relationship, a repressed emotion. Hermes asserted that the same thing happens on a collective scale. The law of cause and effect never ceases to operate. What changes is humanity's willingness to recognize it. When that willingness disappears, the effects begin to seem unjust, unpredictable, or disproportionate. In reality, they merely accumulate. And here arises a silent but powerful question. Could the signs we call crises actually be exact responses to prolonged mental states? Hermes also spoke of a specific phenomenon that arises near the crossing of the line, the illusion of neutrality. People begin to believe that they can observe reality without participating in it, that they can consume, opine, react, without influencing the whole. For Hermes, this is one of the greatest illusions of the modern mind. He taught that no one is outside the system. To think is already to participate. To ignore is already to choose. Absolute neutrality does not exist within universal laws. When a civilization begins to believe in it, it loses sight of its own impact. Another subtle sign is the difficulty in upholding uncomfortable truths. Hermes said that the collective mind, close to the line, prefers narratives that alleviate immediate discomfort, even if they compromise deep understanding. Truths become negotiable. Principles become too flexible. This creates an environment where everything seems relative, except for one's own immediate self-interest. Hermes warned that this extreme relativism is not a sign of maturity, but of disorientation. Then comes the final question of this stage. If the signs are everywhere, why do so few recognize them? Hermes replied that the human mind tends to adapt quickly to imbalance when it sets in gradually. The abnormal becomes normal. The inconsistent becomes acceptable. Discomfort becomes the backdrop of existence. It is at this point that the crossing of the line approaches its decisive moment, because, according to Hermes, when the signs cease to cause strangeness, reality is about to respond more directly, and it is precisely this answer that begins to take shape from the next stage of the cycle. Hermes Trismegistus taught that there comes a point when the journey ceases to be gradual and becomes a consolidated state. There are no trumpets, no announcements. The world keeps turning, people keep waking up, working, planning for the future, but something changes definitively in the relationship between the human mind and reality. It is the point at which the collective vibration stabilizes at a level that makes spontaneous return increasingly improbable. For Hermes, vibration is not an abstract or poetic concept. It is the description of the internal movement that sustains thoughts, emotions, and decisions. Everything vibrates because everything is in motion. When this movement becomes repetitive, automatic, and unconscious, the vibration becomes denser. The mind loses flexibility. Perception narrows. The world begins to be interpreted always through the same filters. A simple example helps to understand this. Think of someone who lives for years in a constant state of alert, anxiety, and comparison. At first, this state causes discomfort. After a while, it becomes familiar. The person no longer knows what it's like to live without tension. The body adapts. The mind adjusts. What was once the exception becomes the norm. Hermes claimed that the same process happens with entire societies. There is a curious fact that illustrates this point. Modern research shows that the average level of sustained attention span in humans has fallen drastically in recent decades. In many contexts, difficulty concentrating is now considered normal. Hermes would say that this is not just a technological effect, but a vibrational reflection. A constantly fragmented mind vibrates in discontinuity. It jumps, reacts, disperses, but rarely delves deeper. In this state, humanity enters what Hermes described as the moment of silent crossing. People continue to talk about change, evolution, and the future, but their decisions follow increasingly predictable patterns. The feeling of choice remains, but the real field of possibilities narrows. There is a story attributed to the Hermetic tradition that illustrates this. A group of travelers crosses a desert, guided by ancient maps. Over time, they begin to ignore the maps, relying only on their recent memory of the route. While the terrain remains similar, nothing seems wrong. But little by little, the ground changes, the climate alters, and when they realize they are lost, they no longer recognize the landmarks. Hermes used this image to speak of the mind that abandons universal principles and begins to be guided only by immediate adaptations. Contemporary events reinforce this interpretation. There have never been so many forecasting systems, data analysis tools, and control models. Yet the prevailing feeling is one of instability. Crises arise in areas that seem secure. Decisions made based on technical efficiency generate unexpected side effects. Hermes asserted that this occurs when the collective vibration moves away from understanding cause and effect at deeper levels. At this turning point, humanity begins to experience a strange contradiction. There are more tools than ever to organize reality, but less clarity about the purpose of that organization. More speed, less direction. More technical connection, less human integration. Hermes said that this is the stage where the dominant vibration ceases to be creative and becomes reactive. The collective mind does not create from understanding, but responds to constant stimuli, news, crises, trends, conflicts. Everything demands an immediate response. Little space remains for contemplation or conscious course correction. An unexpected fact stands out here. Studies in social psychology show that decisions made under constant pressure tend to repeat old patterns, even when those patterns have already proven ineffective. Hermes anticipated this by stating that a mind in dense vibration prefers the familiar to the true. The known, even if dysfunctional, seems safer than the unknown that demands transformation. At this point, the moment of transition is consolidated. Humanity begins to live in short cycles. Problems are superficially resolved so that the system continues to function. The root causes are postponed. Hermes warned that this postponement does not eliminate the consequences, it only accumulates them. There is also a collective psychological effect that arises at this stage, a feeling of unreality. Many people describe the impression that the world is strange, artificial, too fast-paced, as if everything were happening quickly but without depth. Hermes explained this as a vibrational mismatch between the external rhythm and the internal capacity for assimilation. He said that when external vibration surpasses internal integration, reality begins to be experienced as something distant, almost like a spectacle. People observe serious events with increasing indifference, not due to a lack of empathy, but due to perceptual saturation. It's a defense mechanism of the fragmented mind. Another striking statistic is the global increase in disorders related to anxiety and a feeling of loss of meaning, even in contexts of material comfort. Hermes would say that this is not a paradox, it is coherence. External comfort does not compensate for internal misalignment. When the collective vibration deviates from universal laws, emptiness arises even amidst abundance. At the moment of transition, humanity also begins to confuse adaptation with evolution. It adjusts quickly to new scenarios, but rarely questions whether these scenarios are desirable or consistent with deeper principles. Hermes argued that adaptation without awareness can lead to sophisticated forms of stagnation. There is a symbolic story that illustrates this. A river encountering constant obstacles begins to divide into multiple shallow channels. The water continues to flow, but loses depth and force. Hermes used this image to speak of a mind that disperses in multiple directions without integrating any. It is at this stage that the response of universal laws begins to become more evident, not as punishment, but as adjustment. Systems collapse not due to technical failure, but due to internal incoherence. Relationships break down not because of isolated events, but because of an accumulation of ignored misalignments. Hermes taught that the universe constantly seeks balance. When the collective vibration deviates too far from this balance, reality responds with events that force reconsideration. The longer this response is ignored, the more intense it becomes. The moment of transition, therefore, is not a specific instant, but a consolidated state. A point at which humanity is no longer surprised by its own imbalances. It lives within them. It organizes itself around them. It justifies them. And here arises the most unsettling aspect of Hermetic teaching. According to Hermes, not everyone crosses the line in the same way. As the collective vibration intensifies, some individuals begin to feel a growing discomfort, a sense that something is too wrong to ignore. They can no longer adapt without questioning. These individuals feel the weight of the journey before others. They perceive the incoherence. They feel the noise. They question the rhythm. For Hermes, this is neither privilege nor condemnation. It is simply vibrational sensitivity. The moment of transition doesn't end the cycle. It redefines it. From that point on, reality ceases to respond gently and begins to demand a stance. Neutrality becomes impossible. Indifference begins to exact its price. It is precisely at this point that the silent separation begins to take shape clearly. Not between rich and poor, strong and weak, but between those who remain reacting and those who begin to understand. And it is this separation, invisible to the eye, that begins to guide the next stage of the human cycle. Hermes Trismegistus asserted that, after the moment of crossing over, something begins to silently reorganize itself in the fabric of human experience. It is not a visible or declared division. There are no announcements, borders, or clear symbols. The separation happens at the level of perception. Some continue to react to the effects, while others begin, almost against their will, to question the causes. This separation doesn't come as a sudden and comfortable awakening. On the contrary, for those who are beginning to perceive it, the first contact is uncomfortable. A feeling of misalignment with the dominant rhythm arises. What once seemed normal begins to sound strange. What was once desirable begins to seem empty. Hermes said that this discomfort is a sign of internal realignment, not of failure. In everyday life, this manifests itself in simple ways. One person realizes they can no longer consume certain content without feeling mentally exhausted. Another begins to question goals they previously accepted without reflection. Someone else realizes they are repeating emotional patterns that no longer make sense. None of this is spectacular. It's silent, internal, but cumulative. Hermes taught that the law of cause and effect becomes more evident after the crossing because the effects cease to be delayed. Prolonged mental states begin to generate faster consequences. Those who live in constant conflict feel the impact more intensely. Those who cultivate clarity begin to perceive small alignments emerging, even amidst collective chaos. This is a crucial point in Hermetic teaching. Separation does not occur because some are chosen and others are not. It occurs because universal laws respond precisely to the inner state of each individual. There is no favoritism, there is coherence. While most try to restore a sense of normalcy, seeking distractions or narratives to alleviate discomfort, some realize that it is no longer possible to return to the previous state. Hermes said that after a certain point, consciousness does not regress without generating suffering. Pretending not to see becomes too costly. These individuals begin to notice something curious. Even when everything around them seems unstable, they perceive small opportunities for internal reorganization. They change habits, adjust thoughts, observe reactions, not because they expect to save the world, but because they understand that the only reality they can directly transform is their own. Hermes called this a return to causes. Instead of trying to control external outcomes, the individual begins to observe their own mental states. They ask themselves not only what happened, but why they reacted that way. Not only what they feel, but where that feeling comes from. This change seems subtle, but it completely alters the relationship with reality. The external world remains unstable, but it ceases to be experienced as something totally out of control. The person realizes that even in difficult scenarios, there is room for internal choice. This perception is the beginning of the transmutation. On the other hand, those who remain trapped by the effects experience a progressive increase in frustration. They try to solve everything on an external level. They change environments, relationships, discourses, but maintain the same internal states. Hermes stated that this constant effort without transformation generates profound exhaustion. This is where the separation intensifies, not as a judgment but as a natural consequence. Those who do not return to the causes feel that reality becomes increasingly oppressive. Those who return begin to experience a strange sense of clarity amidst the chaos. Hermes warned that this process does not make life easier in a superficial sense. On the contrary, it demands mental responsibility. It requires observing thoughts, emotions, and impulses without shifting blame. It requires accepting that personal reality is, to a large extent, a reflection of the internal state sustained over time. This requirement drives many away. It's more comfortable to believe that everything is external, random, or imposed. Hermes knew this. That's why he said that separation isn't forced. It happens because few are willing to bear the weight of their own conscience. There is an interesting effect at this stage. Those who begin to align themselves with universal laws do not become indifferent to the world. They become more attentive. They perceive inconsistencies that were previously invisible. They sense when something is not in resonance with their inner values. This leads them to different choices, often misunderstood by others. They may seem slower in a fast-paced world, more cautious in an impulsive environment. Hermes said that this is not delay, it is an adjustment of rhythm. A more integrated vibration does not respond to collective haste. Meanwhile, most people continue to seek quick fixes for deep-seated problems. Hermes observed that, after the crossing, these solutions tend to fail more frequently, not because they are poorly planned, but because they ignore the level where the real cause operates. This contrast creates tension. Those who begin to understand find it difficult to communicate what they perceive. Words seem insufficient. Explanations sound abstract to those still focused only on the effects. Hermes said that this incommunicability is part of the process. He taught that at certain points in the cycle, transformation doesn't spread through persuasion, but through silent example, through internal consistency, through the way someone reacts, chooses, and positions themselves. Separation also manifests itself in the way time is experienced. Those who remain reacting feel time as something scarce and oppressive. There is always a lack of time. There is always urgency. Those who begin to return to the causes perceive time differently, no longer as an enemy, but as a field of maturation. Hermes asserted that this shift in the perception of time is a clear sign of ongoing transmutation. When the mind organizes itself internally, the external rhythm ceases to completely dominate experience. This stage offers no guarantees. It doesn't promise constant comfort, but it offers something that blind reaction doesn't: meaning. Even amidst instability, those who understand universal laws begin to perceive coherence in events, not in the sense of absolute control, but of intelligibility. Separation, therefore, is not the end of the collective. It is the beginning of a deeper reorganization. Hermes said that every civilization goes through this point. Few return to the causes, many remain in the effects. Both continue to live, but in increasingly distinct perceptual realities. And the more this difference becomes pronounced, the more evident it becomes that the next stage of the cycle will not be determined by isolated external events, but by the degree of sustained awareness in the face of them. It is at this point that the final question of this stage begins to assert itself, not as a provocation, but as an internal necessity. If universal laws continue to operate, and if transmutation is possible, what exactly needs to be transformed to cross the next threshold with lucidity? The answer to that question doesn't come from outside, and that's precisely what makes the final stage inevitable. Hermes Trismegistus taught that every cycle is only complete when what has been understood is transformed into conscious action. Knowledge that does not alter the way of life remains incomplete. Therefore, the prophecy does not end with a warning, nor with a separation, but with a responsibility. The responsibility to choose, lucidly, how to respond to the stage in which humanity finds itself. After the crossing, comfortable neutrality no longer exists. Ignoring becomes a choice. Reacting automatically becomes more costly. Hermes asserted that this is the moment when the human mind is called upon to assume its role as the active principle of its own reality, not as a mere spectator of events. The feeling that many experience at this stage is paradoxical. While the world seems more unstable, an unprecedented inner clarity emerges, a realization that it's no longer possible to live on autopilot, that repeating old patterns no longer works, that something needs to change, even if it's not entirely clear what. Hermes said that this restlessness is not weakness, it is a sign of alignment beginning to form. When the mind comes into contact with universal laws, it begins to feel discomfort in the face of incoherence. This discomfort is the starting point of transmutation. In Hermetic teachings, transmutation does not mean denying reality or escaping from it. It means changing the internal state from which reality is experienced. This is where the teaching becomes practical, because it does not demand blind faith but honest observation. The first strategic step is mastering attention. Hermes taught that what receives constant attention is strengthened in the mind. Mental states are consolidated through repeated focus. The viewer who wishes to apply this teaching needs to begin by observing where their attention rests throughout the day, not as a judgment, but as a diagnosis. Ask yourself, simply and directly, what does my mind dwell on when there is no immediate external stimulus? Worry, comparison, fear, expectation, guilt, or presence, clarity, intention? This observation already begins the process of transmutation because it brings the cause to consciousness. The second step is emotional responsibility. Hermes stated that emotions are not random events, but internal responses to mental interpretations. This does not mean denying feelings, but understanding them. Whenever an intense emotion arises, the question should not be who caused this, but what interpretation of mind supports this. This change may seem small, but it profoundly alters the relationship with the world. The individual stops reacting automatically and begins to respond consciously. This reduces internal noise and creates space for more aligned choices. The third step is adjusting your vibration through simple habits. Hermes didn't advocate complex practices for everyone, but daily consistency. Small repeated actions shape internal states. Daily silence, even if brief. Conscious reduction of excessive stimuli. Deliberate choice of what is consumed mentally. These practices are not an escape from the world, but an internal reorganization to inhabit it in a more lucid way. A less saturated mind perceives more. A more stable mind reacts less. The fourth step is the conscious observation of cause and effect in one's own life. Hermes taught that the law reveals itself clearly when the individual pays attention. By maintaining a specific mental state for days or weeks, observe the effects. Not to control reality, but to understand its coherence. Notice how recurring thoughts influence decisions, how decisions influence relationships, how relationships influence experiences. This chain of events makes the law alive, not theoretical. From there, transmutation ceases to be a concept and becomes practical. The fifth step is redefining success. Hermes warned that after the crossing, measuring life solely by external results deepens the misalignment. Success at this stage becomes internal coherence. Sleeping with a peaceful mind, acting without betraying fundamental values, maintaining clarity even in unstable scenarios. This doesn't mean rejecting the material world, but putting it into the correct perspective. The external ceases to be an absolute end and becomes a consequence. There is also a profound emotional aspect to this process. Many feel grief when they realize that old goals no longer make sense. Hermes taught that this grief is natural. It marks the end of an identity built in reaction, not in awareness. Resisting this grief prolongs the suffering. Accepting it opens space for something more authentic. Hermes' final prophecy doesn't speak of immediate collective salvation. It speaks of individuals who, by returning to their causes, silently alter the landscape around them, not through preaching, but through consistency, through presence, through consistent choices. He asserted that all real change begins in a conscious minority, not as an elite, but as a point of resonance. When someone lives in alignment with universal laws, their very existence becomes a response to chaos, even without words. That is why this video does not end with a grand promise, but with an intimate invitation. An invitation to observe one's own mind, to assume inner responsibility, to transmute, little by little, the state from which reality is experienced. If anything said here has generated discomfort, questioning or silent recognition that is already a sign. Hermes taught that truth does not shout, it resonates. Now, if you wish to continue exploring these teachings, deepen your understanding of universal laws, and learn how to apply them practically in your life, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, so that more people can access this content. And if you wish, share your questions, insights, or personal experiences in the comments. You can comment anonymously if you prefer. This space exists for conscious reflection, not for judgment. And the next step in the cycle begins precisely where attention is placed now.